From the Gold Coast of Long Island to the Pocono Hills in Westchester County, historic homes and estates can be found in every part of New York. Join us on a journey across our region to visit some of these remarkable homes. All of them true treasures of New York.
Funding for Treasures of New York Historic Homes is provided in partnership with NYC Arts and All Arts. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to this special episode of Treasures of New York. I'm Paula Zahn. The New York region is filled with historic houses and estates, many of them former homes to political figures, artists, among others. In the next half hour, we'll take you inside some of these homes and hear their stories. Stories about New York's history, its people, and its culture. First up, we visit Falaise, an historic mansion that is part of the Sands Point Preserve Conservancy on the Gold Coast of Long Island's North Shore.
My name is Michael Buckowitz. I am the Site Director of Historic Properties for Nassau County Parks, Recreation, and Museums. This house is called Falaise. Falaise means cliff in French. It's the former home of Captain Harry Guggenheim, and it sits on the Sands Point Preserve. These great homes that were built on the Gold Coast of Long Island were built by the titans of industry, were built by these great families. The Vanderbilts, the Fricks, the Phipps, these great homes were built as summer homes. They were used a few months out of the year, and they built lavish, either English, French, Spanish-style houses to give them sort of a European atmosphere of their vacations. Not many of the homes are still in existence. Some of the homes became schools, country clubs, or completely torn down. Hempstead House was built by Howard Gould for his first wife. They never even spent a night here in Hempstead House. She ran off with another man. They divorced, and Daniel Guggenheim purchased what was called Castle Gould at the time and renamed it Hempstead House. He lived here with his family and his wife Florence for many years until his death. Then we have Falaise. Falaise, 90 acres, was given to Captain Harry Guggenheim upon his marriage to Carol Morton. They went on a year-long honeymoon, and they brought their architect, Frederick Sterner, with them to buy artifacts, artwork, architectural pieces, doors, you name it. The entire property was built sort of as a feudal kingdom. It had its own farm, its own dairy, it had cattle. And Daniel Guggenheim made a joke. He said, you can have a glass of champagne or a glass of milk, both cost about the same. We're standing right now in the living room of the house. One of my favorite pieces is the mantelpiece, the French mantelpiece. It had been dismantled from a chateau in France, numbered, shipped here back to New York, and hand-assembled, matching all the numbers. And the grand staircase. The staircase was also brought from France. The captain wanted the house to have a very authentic look of a house that was built during the 15th and 16th centuries of a French Norman castle. And he went as far as buying Dutch bricks that were a certain color brought back, and the mortar being applied exactly the way it would have been applied in that time. The house has two looks. When you look at it from the front, it's a very small Chateau Manor type. When you see it from the back, it's this huge castle rising up from the water. The pool area, which we have today, was originally the Rose Garden. The captain had a heart ailment and was told that swimming would be a great exercise for his heart. So out went the roses and in went the swimming pool. Captain Harry Guggenheim was a great lover of aviation. He heard of this flight that Charles Lindbergh was going to take from Long Island to Paris, France. He went to Roosevelt Field, where he was going to take off, and introduced himself and told Colonel Lindbergh, when you come back, look me up. And he did. When he came back from France, and they had the great parade in New York City, Colonel Lindbergh stayed here and wrote his book, We, here at Falaise. And that was the beginning of Guggenheim and Lindbergh's great friendship.
America has demanded with one voice that the inhuman abductors of this innocent child shall not escape their just fate.
Falaise became a haven for the Lindberghs. Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh came here and stayed here while the whole media scandal was going on about the Lindbergh child, the kidnapping. The captain wanted every room to have a beautiful view. So most of the house is laid out room next to each room, except for a few rooms, that this way every room could have a view of the water. In the late 1960s, the captain had seen a lot of the great houses being torn down. And the captain still lived here and still summered here from May through October and truly loved this house. That's when he decided to create a historic home. He would leave this house and the acreage surrounding it to Nassau County to create a historic mansion. Upon his death in 1971, nothing new would be allowed to be added to the house. He had a strict list of things, and the way the tour would run, he designed everything about the historic house. And upon its opening day, his great friend, Charles Lindbergh, came for a tour of the house and went through the whole house, and they got to the captain's book room. And there were no books in the room. The captain had left all his books to Annapolis. And so Charles Lindbergh was horrified that there were no books in his room. So he drove to his house, loaded up his Ford Falcon, drove back with all of his books from his own library to fill the library shelves at Falaise.
And now we take a trip north to Kykuit, former home to the Rockefeller family and one of the great estates of the historic Hudson Valley.
Kykuit is the home to the Rockefeller family. There were 4 generations of family to have lived in this home, and it was considered the family seat for John Davison Rockefeller Sr. The word Kykuit is an Old Dutch word. It means lookout or overlook. It is fitting because we are on the top of a hill. We sit 500 feet above sea level. Perfect area for a beautiful home. The house is done in the classical style, and the gardens are the gardens that you might find in an Italian villa. The original building of Kykuit was in 1909 when the family moved in. They redid the facade in 1913 with a pediment right below the roof, reminiscent of the ancient Roman temples. Within that pediment sit 2 large figures, one being Apollo, the god of the arts, and the other being Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. And that was a symbol of unity between nature and culture, something that this estate was meant to embody. There were 2 important architects that we had working on this home, one being Ogden Codman, who was responsible for the interiors of this home. William Wells Bosworth created all the gardens that you would see throughout this estate. The ones that surround the house are much more formal, and the further out you go, the further your eye looks, they become more informal and graduate into the landscape. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was the one who put a lot of classical sculpture on the ground. Oceanus is the largest fountain we have on this estate. It was placed here in 1913. It was fashioned after the Oceanus that you would find in the Boboli Gardens in Florence, Italy. Oceanus being the king of the river gods, commanding the seated figures to pour forth water into the oceans. There are 3 figures there, and they represent the rivers of the Old World, the Ganges, the Euphrates, and the Nile. And the reason it was placed in the east looking to the west is because we are going to link the Hudson River, the river of the New World, to the rivers of the Old World. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was the grandson of John D. Rockefeller Sr. He resided here as the third generation of family, and what he gave to this estate was sculpture and art. We have 5 art galleries in the downstairs area of this home filled with modern art. We have more than 70 pieces of outdoor sculpture alone, ranging from Henry Moore to Noguchi. He was passionate about art, a great collector of the arts, and he considered himself an environmental artist, and by that he meant he was going to study the environment, find where the best location for each of his outdoor pieces would be, so that sculpture would enhance nature, and in turn nature would enhance that piece of sculpture. Triangular Surface in Space by the artist Max Bill. It is set at the end of the Rose Pergola. It overlooks the Hudson River, and it is as if it's a telescopic view of the Hudson. The inner garden is flanked by 2 sunken gardens. When Nelson lived here, he had exchanged the sunken gardens and he put in sunken swimming pools, which makes the piece that he put in between the 2 pools perfectly situated. Aristide Maillol's bather putting up her hair looks as if she's going to jump into the water, and when Nelson lived here, she could have. Nelson Rockefeller wanted everybody to enjoy what he had enjoyed throughout his life. So he put in his will that when he passed away, this home would be given to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, along with 87 acres surrounding this estate that would be open to the public, and tours would be given to the public by Historic Hudson Valley.
Coming up next, we take you to the Noble Maritime Collection at the historic Snug Harbor Cultural Center on Staten Island. The museum is located in what was once a dormitory in a retirement home for mariners in the 19th century. Today, the museum is dedicated to preserving the history of Sailors' Snug Harbor. It also honors the legacy of its namesake, the marine artist John A. Noble.
Sailors' Snug Harbor is the first democratic charitable institution established in this country. It was established by the will of Robert Richard Randall, written by Alexander Hamilton in 1801. When Robert Richard Randall was a young man, a kid could go to sea at the age of 12 or 14 and maybe never come home again. End up on the other side of the world, separated from his family. And Randall had seen that over the years as he went to sea. So when he was on his deathbed, he said that he wanted to make a home for aged, decrepit, and worn-out seamen. The trustees bought a farm here on Staten Island, and gradually that became an enormous self-sustaining institution. Sailors' Snug Harbor was an 80-acre facility. It had 8 dormitories, a beautiful church, a chapel, a sanitarium with 9 wards, a 400-bed hospital, a farm, barnyard, pigsty, paint house. Also, they employed a large staff of people. It was a self-sustaining place. This building was a dormitory. There were about 36 small rooms, 2 men apiece. It was the second building constructed here on site. I would say over the years it served maybe 10,000 people. They provided health care, food, recreation. It was a democratic institution. They respected each other. Everyone was called captain. And the men worked. They made artifacts. They did basket weaving and scrimshaw. They built ship models, and they talked about their past, talked about their lives at sea. By their 1930s, you see things like Social Security coming into being. But more importantly, people did not go to sea, never to return. So the population here began to dwindle, began to close buildings, then they began to tear down buildings in the 1950s. The trustees decided that they would give the property to the city of New York for $1. And the city of New York said, no thanks, we don't want it. So the trustees sold it to a developer. And the community then really realized this is going to be lost. And so, led by people like John A. Noble, they managed to persuade John Lindsay to buy the property back as a park and cultural center. John Noble grew up in an art colony, though he preferred playing with the fishermen's children, as he said, in Provincetown. And his family moved to New York in the early 1920s. He went to sea first when he was 13 on a large schooner, the Anna Sophia, and in summers while he was in school, he went on sailing vessels, and then he joined the crew of the Annie C. Ross. So he had a lot of sea experience. He discovered a ship's graveyard on the Kilvan Cull and began to haunt it. Port Johnston was the largest graveyard of wooden sailing vessels in the world. He roamed through the harbor in his rowboat, drawing, sketching, sleeping under wrecks, and meeting all the people that worked in the waterfront. Port Johnston, to him, symbolized the end of the age of sail, and he found this tragic, and that became the passion of his life. This cabin was on the pier of the Boneyard. He said one day in a fit of creativity, he cut a hole in the ceiling to make a skylight, and over the years, little by little, he added things like this. This is an engineer's bed. This is where he went to do his art. Later on, the pier on which this little cabin sat began to rot away, and he said, you know, he was frantic. There was no place else he could draw. So he built a barge. He said, that's how I became the artist with the floating studio. There was no cuteness or color to this. I built the barge to save my studio. And that's where he worked all through the 40s until he died. He did about 150 oil paintings, and he did 80 lithograph editions, as well as 600 plein air drawings. And then, astonishingly, we have 6,000 photographs that he took of the harbor. Our mission is to celebrate the people and traditions of New York Harbor. We do it through the work of John Noble, who captured so much of the 20th century history in his work. We do it by studying Sailor Snug Harbor, which is an extremely important component, not only of maritime history, but a history of taking care of frail and elderly adults as well. And we also celebrate the modern waterfront.
And now, our last stop. We visit the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Corona, Queens, devoted to celebrating the life of the jazz icon. Armstrong lived in this modest home in a working-class neighborhood for 28 years.
The mission of the Louis Armstrong House Museum is to operate Louis's house as a historic house. People show up from all over the world every day to take a tour of it. Louis and Lucille Armstrong were married in 1942, bought this house in 1943, and lived here for the rest of their lives. Louis passed away in 1971. Lucille continued to live here until 1983, and nobody has lived in the house since Lucille Armstrong. It's frozen in time. One of the remarkable things about Louis Armstrong living in this house is this is a working class, middle class neighborhood in Queens. And Louis, at the time they purchased the house, was already a superstar. Louis loved Corona. He would walk 2 blocks up and 1 block over to Joe's Artistic Barbershop, wait his turn in line, exchange news with men in the community, and get his hair cut there. Louis loved the kids from the neighborhood, maybe in part because Louis was married 4 times and never had any children by his marriages himself. The living room is the largest room in the house. There's a wonderful portrait of Louis Armstrong by an African-American artist named Cal Bailey. Lewis was typically on the road 300 days per year all over the world, so he would bring back things from his travels. The guest bathroom on the first floor is covered with mirrors, gold-plated fixtures, and a white onyx sink. Lewis grew up very poor. He and his mother and sister lived in a two-room house with a dirt floor and no indoor plumbing in turn-of-the-century New Orleans. So to have a bathroom like this, Lewis was very proud of it. For many people, Lucille's kitchen is their favorite room in the house. This is a state-of-the-art kitchen designed and installed in 1970. There's a stove which has 6 burners, 2 ovens, and 2 broilers, and there's a plaque that says custom made by Crown for Mr. and Mrs. Louis Armstrong. The den, in many ways, is the most significant room in the house. Louis sat in this chair in the den and at this desk, and he practiced his trumpet. He wrote letters to friends and fans. He talked on the telephone. When he was home, this is where he spent much of his waking time. One of the most stunning discoveries in the Louis Armstrong collection, discovered here in this house, was Louis's home recorded tapes. There were 700 reels of tape. About half of them are dubs of favorite LPs and 78s, but the other half of the tapes are candidly recorded tapes.
At home in Corona, Long Island, New York, February 26, 1956.
February 6th.
Correction, February 6.
He would just hit the record button and let it roll. It's Louis practicing his trumpet.
And as this record play along, I think I'm gonna noodle a little with it, you know, for old time's sake.
One of the most recent acquisitions is the only known video of Louis in the recording studio. He went into the recording studio to make an album, Satchmo Plays King Oliver, and the producer hired a professional film crew to film Louis making the album. Nobody had ever done this before. But decades later, this video resurfaced, and Ricky Riccardi, our director of research collections, was able to acquire it.
We already had movie footage, we already had TV footage, we had all this kind of stuff. But to see him in the studio, to see the concentration, to see, you know, the laid-back feel and all that stuff, just absolutely priceless. And the kind of thing that no one knew was out there.
We've now assembled the world's largest archives, not just for Louis Armstrong, but for any jazz musician anywhere.
He's one of the greatest musicians, one of the greatest humanitarians, greatest figures in the world. And we want to tell people about him, what made him so great. And when people come to us, they learn about him through his own possessions, which is a unique way to learn about one of the 20th century's greatest icons. This is Louis Armstrong's library. These are all the books that were found in the house. This is Famous American Negroes by Langston Hughes. We have boxes and boxes of fan letters to Louis Armstrong. It says, "Old Satchmo himself, wherever he is." This is Louis Armstrong's record collection. He left behind about 2,000 records. Rimsky-Korsakov, he's got his classical music. We have about 17,000 photos. We have sheet music, the original arrangement of What a Wonderful World. And I don't think anybody could have predicted it at the time, but this became by far his most famous song, the song most people associate with him. People ask us all the time, what was he thinking about when he recorded this song? And we have the answer on tape.
It's so much in Wonderful World that brings me back to my neighborhood where I live in Corona. I saw 3 generations come up in that block. And they're all with their children, grandchildren. They come back to see Uncle Satchmo and Aunt Lucille. That's why I can say, I hear babies cry. I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I look at all them kids' faces. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Ooh, yeah.
I hope you've enjoyed this tour through some of the New York region's incredible historic homes. I'm Paula Zahn. Thanks for watching Treasures of New York.